few years ago, a friend of mine, Luann, was over for a Sunday afternoon spin in with some other friends, and she commented that she had just bought this beautiful hank of fiber that was hand dyed at one of the sheep and wool festivals, and she'd spun it up, and she was so disappointed because it had all turned to mud. And at the time I remember thinking, oh, that would be a good sort of class to have or a good little video to shoot, because there's so many different ways you can work with these hand painted fibers to create the effect you want. And then it always got put to the bottom of my to-do list. So finally, a couple weeks ago, I asked Kathy to take one of the hand painted variegated rovings that we sell at the store and knit it up. I had her spin it up rather in 4 different ways, and then knit up swatches so we could kind of talk about the various ways of handling it. Because sometimes these beautiful hand painted hanks of fiber are very monochromatic, like this one here with just subtle changes, and other times you see a little bit of contrast, but not a lot. And then you'll find hanks that have a huge range of colors in them, and this one even has like sort of all the primaries, which are sometimes really hard to work with. And then sometimes you'll see roving that may not appeal to you in the actual fiber, but once it's spun up, it actually can be very attractive. So sometimes you can get something you really love and as a hand painted hank, and then have it spin up and not like it, and other times you can overlook something that might be really fun just because you think, oh, that's like really shocking colors, or gee, that looks like mud, and yet it, depending upon how you handle it, it can really come out beautifully. So I wanted to just show her samples. Okay, so I had Kathy spin up samples of this particular colorway of Northern Lights. Northern Lights is a very finely drafted pencil roving that I sell here in a lot of different colors. It's really, really easy to spin. And okay, so here are the first 2 samples. These are the 2 skeins that Kathy spun as singles, so they are not plied. The first one here on the left is the finer singles. This is spun to a fingering weight gauge of about 7 stitches to the inch on a size 3 needle. And the heavier sample here was spun to a heavy worsted / Aran weight gauge of about 4.5 stitches to the inch on an 8 or a 9. And this isn't exactly rocket science, and a lot of it is very intuitive, but sometimes the picture's worth 1,000 words. So what you would imagine, actually, if you thought about spinning a variegated or hand-painted fiber like this, if you spin it thinner, as in this sample here, you're going to get longer stretches in the yarn of the red before it transitions to the green and to the gold. Whereas when you spin it thicker and heavier, you're going to have shorter sections of each color because it's a thicker yarn. So that makes a lot of sense. So when you look at the 2 skeins, what you might discern here is that the yarn that is actually spun finer doesn't look as bold. It looks a little bit muddier, I think, compared to the heavier weight skein, where the color sections, because they're shorter, sort of stand out more abruptly, and so this looks a little bit bolder. By contrast, when you then knit these up, you'll see that the finer yarn knits up a little bit Noro-esque, and which again makes sense because you have long strands or segments of each color because the roving has been spun finer. So when you knit it up, you get gradual grading or striping of one color before it bleeds into another color and then transitions to yet another color. So the colors are very distinct, even though in the yarn it actually looks a little bit muddier and less distinct than the bulky. When you knit the singles, the finer singles up, it looks more distinct compared to and striping compared to the heavier weight yarn. When knit up, you still get nice distinct colors, but instead of it being Noro-esque and giving you any stripes, because each of the color sections is shorter, you get a little bit more of what I usually think of as kind of Monet-ish coloring or watercoloring. Just because the sections are shorter, the colors blend more and you don't get the striping as you do when you spin it finer. So that's the comparison of the 2 singles yarn. Now, if we look at the 2 yarns that are both spun finely, but the first one, this one to the left, is the singles, and this one on the right is the plied version of the fine yarn, you'll see that the plied version looks much tweedier. And that, again, is intuitive and makes sense if you think about the fact that if you've spun your singles up from a variegated or hand-painted fiber like this, and you have sections of red that transition to green and gold, when you then ply the fiber from one bobbin to the fiber on the other bobbin, if you're doing a standard 2-ply, there are sections where the red will ply against the green and the gold will ply against the green. And so you're going to get a marled yarn, or one that looks much tweedier compared to the singles. So if you don't want a tweed effect, you should plan, when you're working with one of these hand paint yarns, you should think about knitting a singles, spinning and knitting a singles, because once you ply it and you get this tweed effect, your color is going to get much more diluted in the plied version versus the singles version. So again, these are still spun to a similar gauge, and so you get the hint of some striping effect because we've got long sections going on here, but overall it's a tweedier swatch and it looks more diluted or muted compared to the singles because the colors are plying with other colors. So neither is right or wrong. It's just a matter of thinking about what the resulting fabric is that you want, and based on that, then choosing whether you're going to spin a singles and work with that because you want a very clear, sharper distinction between your colors, or if you want a tweedy effect, then you should definitely plan on plying your yarn. Okay, so these are both finely spun singles and plied. So now let's take a look at the bulkies. And I actually shouldn't have called these bulky. They're technically Aran weight, 4.5 stitches to the inch. But they at least form a comparison for the finer gauge that we just took a look at. So the heavier weight yarn, here again is the singles, which we looked at before, comparing it to the fine singles. And again, you have short sections of color, so the skein looks rather bold. And when you knit that swatch up, you keep the color distinct, so you still see stitches which are just gold or just green or just red, but instead of it being very striping, you get a little bit more blending of the colors compared to the finer spun singles where the stripes were larger and much more distinct. Now if we want to compare that to the plied heavyweight or Aran weight yarn, by comparing the two skeins, again, just like with the finer weight, you'll see that the plied looks much tweedier because just like for the singles weight, you get the green crossing with the red and the gold with the green, etc. So the skein looks much tweedier, and when that gets knit up, you see there's a lot more melding of the colors, and not a right or a wrong. It's just a matter of thinking about what effect you want.